Hello everyone, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ages of Empires, where we will be going through all the major world empires throughout history. In this episode, we will be covering the Huns and, of course, Attila the Hun, and the 16 Kingdoms period and Jian. It's pronounced, but in Latin characters, that's Jian. That's Fujian. And my apologies for any mispronunciations going forward. I'm trying to find a balance between both being correct as per native speakers, but also as being followable by non-native speakers. So nonetheless, I'll try to get the spelling when applicable. So the structure of this series is we'll be going through the rise and fall of each empire, sort of inspired by Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, or also the rise and fall of the Third Reich by Shearer. And as well, in the style of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, we will highlight a leader from each respective empire and have a comparison between the two leaders in the end to learn a little bit more about the leaders, about the end, and their respective empires. So, without further ado, and once again, well, not once again, but just to mention, so the Huns is more of a confederation, but under Attila it did function very much like an empire, but the 16 Kingdoms period, hence the name, actually covers 16 empires. So we have covered many distinct Chinese empires, but we've also included the Warring States period and the Three Kingdoms period. So this is another one of the intermediary periods we'll be covering in China, but we will still focus on some specific dynasties as well. But without further ado, we will begin with the Huns before proceeding to the 16 Kingdoms, as we shall see. So, the Huns were a nomadic Central Asian people whose rise and fall significantly impacted the course of European and Asian history. Their origin is not decisively known, but they are believed to have emerged from the region around the Caspian Sea in the 3rd century AD. The Huns were a confederation of various tribes under the leadership of powerful chieftains, and they became a formidable force on the steppes of Central Asia. The Huns, furthermore, lived in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe between the 4th and 6th century AD, or CE, Common Era. According to the European tradition, they were first reported living east of the Volga River in an area that was part of Scythia at the time. The Huns' arrival in Europe, is associated with the migration westward of the Iranian people, the Alans they are called, and by 370 CE, the Huns had arrived on the Volga. By 430, they had established a vast, if short-lived, dominion in Europe, which we shall see, conquering the Goths and many other Germanic peoples living outside the Roman borders, and causing many others to flee into Roman territory. So, as following in decline and fall of the Roman Empire, so the Roman Empire is getting threatened by the Germanic tribes, but on the other side, the Germanic tribes were getting threatened by the Huns, so it's interesting take to now see here. The Huns, especially under the King Attila, the famous Attila the Hun, whom I'm sure, or it's very likely, you have heard of, made frequent and devastating raids into the Eastern Roman Empire. So this is after the split between the Eastern and Roman Empire. In 451, they invaded the western Roman provinces of Gaul, where they fought a combined army of Romans and Visigoths at the Battle of the Catalonian Fields. And in 452 CE, they invaded Italy as well. After the death of Attila in 453, the Huns ceased to be a major threat to Rome and lost much of their empire following the Battle of Nidau in circa means approximately, 454 CE. Descendants of the Huns or successors with similar names are recorded by neighboring populations to the south, east, and west as having occupied parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia from about the 4th to the 6th century CE. Variants of the Hun name are recorded in the Caucasus until as early as the 8th century. In the 18th century, many years later, French scholar Joseph de Guignes became the first to propose a link between the Huns and the Xiongnu people, that's Xiongnu, whom we've discussed much in reference to the ancient Chinese history, who were nomadic people who lived in northern China from the 3rd century BC to BCE, before Common Era, to the late 1st century AD. Since Guignes' time, considerable scholarly effort has been devoted to investigating such a connection. The issue remains controversial, but recent archaeogenetic studies show some Han-era individuals to have DNA similar to populations in ancient Mongolia. The relationship with other entities such as the Iranian Huns and the Huna people of South Asia have also been disputed. So interesting that we've covered many of these nomadic people such as the Xiongnu or the Xianbei of ancient China. We have a specific episode on the Xiongnu Confederation, and it's interesting that they were also nomadic, so we do see parallels, at least in terms of lifestyle. The Huns did in some ways live a lot like the Xiongnu people or the Xiongnu Confederation, and if they're genetically linked, that would explain a lot as well. So if you haven't checked out the episode on the Xiongnu people or the Xiongnu Confederation, I hope you do so. And if not, also many of the other dynasties of China that we've covered in the past also have many references to the Xiongnu peoples and confederation, which for a time functioned much like an empire, much like the Huns, as we shall see. So as for more detail into the rise of the Huns, so migration westward. The Huns began their westward migration in the late 4th century, putting pressure, that's CE, Common Era, putting pressure on neighboring tribes and forcing some of them to move westward as well. So by moving west, they're pushing others west as well. They migrated across the Central Asian steppes, reaching the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, whom we've covered in a specific episode, and the Sassanian Empire in the 4th century. As for conflict with the Eastern Roman Empire, in the 370s CE, under the leadership of the chieftain Uldin, that's Uldin, the Huns clashed with the Eastern Roman Empire. The Huns' military tactics, which included horse archery and swift maneuvers, proved highly effective against the traditional Roman army. The Romans suffered defeats, and the Huns extracted tribute from the Byzantine Empire. So a very formidable force to battle against the Byzantine Empire, which was established by Constantine, as I hope you have checked out the episode on the Byzantine Empire, and if you haven't, I hope you do so, and thank you very much if you have. But I also, as for horse archers, I always think it's sort of a fascinating physics problem, or physics solution, that, for example, if the horse is going 60 miles per hour and you shoot the arrow 100 miles per hour, the arrow is actually going 160 miles per hour, so it's actually, the velocities add together. But if you shoot backwards, it actually detracts. But nonetheless, there's a passage in the Old Testament with David and Goliath, and at least in my translation of the King James Bible, he's running towards Goliath, and he throws a stone. So if you're running and throw a stone, it actually goes faster. So that's sort of something special about the horse archer. So even if the Roman armor was extra great, maybe it could repel most bows and arrows. If there's someone riding on a horse and shooting an arrow, it would be very, very hard to defend against. Now, as for Attila the Hun, but we will discuss him more in a specific biography soon. So the most famous and influential Hun chieftain was Attila, who rose to power in the mid-5th century. Attila, along with his brother, Bleda, B-L-E-D-A, or Bleda perhaps, consolidated Hunnic power and negotiated treaties with both the Eastern and Western Roman empires, so they knew how to deal with both, extracting significant concessions based on their military strength. As for the height of the Hunnic power, that's the invasion of the Western Roman Empire marked the height of their power. In 451 CE, Attila launched a massive invasion of the Western Roman Empire, crossing the Rhine River and ravaging Gaul, which is in modern-day France. And the Romans, led by Flavius Actius, and their Visigoth allies defeated Attila at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. So their sort of peak, or their height, was when they invaded the Western Roman Empire, but it also marked their ultimate, or the beginning of their decline. Further to their invasion of Italy, Attila turned his attention to Italy in 452 CE, but withdrew after meeting with Pope Leo I. The exact reason for his withdrawal is unclear, however, but it is often attributed to a combination of diplomatic efforts and logistical challenges. Or maybe religion even, maybe he converted, but I think it would have been documented if he did. But we will discuss this more in the biography of him to come. As for the fall of the Huns, so starting with the death of Attila, Attila died in 453 CE, just a year after meeting with the Pope, and another year, 2 years before crossing the Rhine River, under mysterious circumstances, possibly due to a hemorrhage. With his death, the unity among the Huns weakened and the empire began to fragment. So the fact that it wasn't documented how he died, maybe it was something particularly bad, or maybe very unnotable as well. But unlikely, unlikely very interesting, like if it was an assassination, it probably would have been documented or something. Or, on the other hand, if it was an assassination, maybe it was hidden as well. So as for the internal conflicts which ensued, after Attila's death, power struggles and internal conflicts among the Hun nobility contributed to the disintegration of the Hunnic Confederation. The Huns faced challenges from both within and from external forces. So not saying it's necessarily true today, but in pretty much all the empires that we've covered, their decline has been closely linked with lack of centralization, or lack of the central government. So with the Huns, it was already a sort of loosely built confederation. Under Attila, there was much centralization, as his court was even considered the capital wherever he might have been. But after he was dead, internal strife and power struggles sort of led to its decline. Maybe if his descendants were better equipped to hold the central authority, maybe it would have lasted longer. As for dispersal and legacy, so the defeat at Nadeo led to the dispersal of the Huns. Some migrated eastward, going back, while others integrated with the various peoples they had come in contact with. So many of their descendants are sort of mixed across Europe. The Huns left a lasting impact on European history, as one might guess, influencing the movement of nomadic groups and contributing to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Thus, the rise and fall of the Huns had a far-reaching consequences for the history of Europe, as it played a significant role in the decline of the Roman Empire and the reshaping of the political landscape in the post-Roman era. So that is the history of the rise and fall of the Huns. Now we'll discuss them a bit more by focusing more on the life of Attila himself. So Attila the Hun, one of the most infamous or famous figures in history, was a powerful chieftain who led the Huns in the 5th century CE. While the details of his early life are somewhat obscure, historical accounts provide insights into his rise to power, military campaigns, and the circumstances surrounding his death. So it's supposed that he was born in circa 406 CE and died in 453 CE, so living only 47 years supposedly. Frequently called Attila the Hun, was the ruler of the Huns from 434 until his death, so ruling just 19 years. Still a pretty substantial time, however. In March 453, March is the same month actually that Julius Caesar died, the Ides of March the 15th. He was also known as the leader of the empire consisting of the Huns, the Ostrogoths, the Alans, and the Bulgars, among others in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. So consolidating, he was the culmination of the consolidation of many different nomadic peoples. As for his early life and rise to power, his birth and background, Attila was likely born around 406 AD, as mentioned, the son of Munzuk, a chieftain of the Huns. So have some sort of noble birth by his father being a chieftain, maybe the leading chieftain even likely. His uncle, Rugila, and his brother, Blida, also played significant roles in the leadership of the Huns. As for his shared leadership with Bleda after the death of their uncle Rugila around 434 CE, Attila and his brother Bleda assumed joint leadership of the Huns. Together they negotiated with Eastern and Western empires, extracting tributes and agreements. So not just great military strategists or military victors, but they were also successful in diplomacy. But as for the assassination of Bleda in 445 CE, Bleda died under suspicious circumstances, and Attila became the sole ruler of the Hun. It's often considered likely that he was assassinated. There are conflicting accounts of Bleda's death, with some suggesting that Attila played a role in his brother's demise, maybe even calling for the assassination, or maybe even doing it himself, but that's not fully documented, and that's speculation. As for Attila's reign and military campaigns, starting with his invasion of the Eastern Roman Empire, Attila turned his attention to the Eastern Roman Empire, leading several successful campaigns. He negotiated the Treaty of Margus with the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II, very famous emperor, in 448 CE, securing an annual tribute in gold. As for his invasion then to the Western Empire, Attila's most famous campaigns were against the Western Roman Empire. In 451 CE, or 452 CE as other sources say, he invaded Gaul, which was a Roman province. But his advance was halted by a coalition of Roman and Visigoth forces. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, I think I've been pronouncing that wrong, but Catalonian, but not like Catalan, but Catalaunian Plains. So, sort of the turning point in his successful military career. But nonetheless, his invasion of Italy continued. In 452 CE, a year later, or maybe 453 CE, but nonetheless a year later, regardless of which date we pick for his crossing of the Rhine, Attila invaded Italy, reaching as far as the outskirts of Rome. He withdrew suddenly, however, after meeting Pope Leo I, and the reasons for his withdrawal remain subject to debate among historians. As we shall see, there's a beautiful painting by Raphael to sort of depict his interpretation of it. As for his death, Attila died in 453 CE under mysterious circumstances. According to some accounts, he suffered a severe nosebleed on his wedding night and bled to death. But maybe something else happened, but that seems specific enough that it seems likely, so that would be the one that I would believe to be true. Other sources, however, suggest that he succumbed to the effects of excessive drinking, possibly in a state of intoxication. So maybe the nosebleed, he was so drunk and he had the nosebleed, maybe both are true. I think it's better to give both credit than to give neither credit. I think for a story like these to be passed down for so long, I think there's got to be at least some truth. I think at least on one part, he probably had some sort of drinking problem for this story to have been carried down throughout history. As for his legacy and impact, starting with the disintegration of the Hunnic Empire, after Attila's death, the unity of the Hunnic Confederation weakened, leading to internal conflicts and external pressures from neighboring tribes and from within the Confederation. But nonetheless, his influence on European history, Attila's invasions, had a profound impact on the political landscape of Europe, interacting with both the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, as well as many of the large number of Germanic tribes. The Huns' campaigns contributed to the decline of the Western Roman Empire and the subsequent migrations of various Germanic and Hunnic tribes. As we shall see, as we have seen in the episode on the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire fell before the Eastern Roman Empire from a large part from these invasions, but they indiscriminately call anyone who's non-Roman barbarians. Doesn't necessarily mean they're barbarians. They call the Persians barbarians, they call the Germans barbarians, they call the Huns barbarians, but nonetheless, the Huns were one of the leading or significant causes in the decline of the Western Roman Empire, and in effect, in some ways, the Eastern Roman Empire as well, but the Eastern Roman Empire lasted much longer. Attila's life and legacy continue to capture the imagination and exploits of Attila, and he is often portrayed in both positive and negative lights throughout history. Some sources depict him as a ruthless conqueror. That's sort of the first sort of image I got of him. Attila the Hun was always described as a dangerous tyrant as growing up, but having done some now research to him, he seems to be nuanced. I think he was in many ways good for his people, although he wasn't good for the Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire particularly. That doesn't mean he wasn't good for the Huns. Some sources depict him as a ruthless conqueror, while others emphasize his diplomatic skills in negotiations with the Roman empires, particularly the Eastern Roman Empire. So that the fact that he was able to negotiate successfully, for example, the gold tribute with the Eastern Roman Empire, is evidence of some level of negotiation abilities. Attila's life and legacy continue to capture the imagination, and his exploits remain a significant chapter in the history of the late Roman Empire and the migrations that reshaped Europe in the post-Roman period. So very, very important leader. Never covered in Plutarch's Parallel Lives because Plutarch only covered ancient Greek and ancient Roman history, so I'm grateful that I was able to cover him. So to discuss the content of the slide, but we'll discuss Attila more in a comparison with Jian after covering the 16 Kingdoms period of China. So the title of this slide and of this portion of the episode is The Huns and Attila. Could have said Attila and the Huns, but because the order focused on the Huns before Attila. So The Huns and Attila is the title I've come up with, or we have come up with. They were a nomadic people who lived in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. They conquered the Goths and many other Germanic peoples and invaded the Roman Empire. That being the Roman empires even, that's both the Eastern and the Western, but they more so invaded the Western and more so negotiated with the Eastern, at least under Attila's rule. As for information, we have a significant leader, Attila, Empire, the Huns, period, the 370s to 469 CE. Modern location, Hungary, as with the name Hun is based off Hungary, Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, Germany, Italy, and France, but to a lesser extent Italy and France as they were invading those territories. Million square kilometers, 0.8, so a little bit smaller than some of the empires we've covered, and million square miles, 0.31. However, it must be noted that these are very highly contested areas. The German barbarians were no insignificant threat, and the Western Roman Empire was probably the most formidable military force at the time, or with Eastern as well. So although they only claimed 0.8% or 0.59% of the world, excluding Antarctica, it's still a very, very significant piece of territory they ruled over. Their capital city, for example, was Attila's court and various other locations, depending on who was the leading chieftain, but they did not have a central capital as did the Romans with, for example, Rome. But even before the split between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, Rome even started to decline in terms of being the primary capital. For example, there was Milan started to become a leading capital, as well as some of the Augusti started to rule from there, such as Maximian. But nonetheless, that is something to be discussed in the Roman context. The government was a tribal confederation. Common languages included Hunnic, Gothic, and various other tribal languages. There's little known about the religion of the Huns, but likely some sort of divination or likely shamanism as well. Population was in the hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, so a little bit smaller in terms of population, but they did not have, as they were nomadic people, they did not have extensive agriculture, as one might guess. They likely were drinking a lot of lactose, which obviously made them quite a bit stronger, though they were very muscular, likely, as people have hypothesized. But nonetheless, it's hard to have a huge, massive population living off a nomadic sort of nomadic provisions, essentially. In the images in the top left, we have a beautiful old image of what Attila might have looked at. You see him holding a sword as well, and a crown as well. I think it's a very beautiful piece of art there. To the right of that, we have an image of the arrival of the Huns in Pannonia, which is an image from the Chronicon Pictum, produced in 1358 CE, so many years later, but still a beautiful piece of art and a beautiful piece of literature as well. To the right of that, we have a 19th century depiction of Attila in Certosa di Pavia monastery in northern Italy. So he's even depicted by the Romans as well. In below that, we have a 1910 Roche-Gosse depiction of a Roman villa in Gaul being sacked by the hordes of Attila the Hun. So sort of showing this lasting impact that it had on the Western Roman Empire and Italian artists following. And to the right, we have the famous Raphael's the meeting between Leo the Great and Attila. It depicts Pope Leo I, escorted by St. Peter and St. Paul, meeting with the Han Emperor outside Rome. They're not certain what the negotiations were, but maybe it was because the Huns already had underhand. Maybe it was the adoration for the religion, Christianity, or some other cause, but a very beautiful painting by the very great Raphael. And at the top right, we have a map showing the geographical extent of the Huns' confederation. As we can see, it covers much of these ancient regions, covering up into Ukraine, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova as well. Not reaching down to Dalmatia, but eventually they did go into Italy, even as far as northern France as well. But noting that they came from the east, all the way from the Xiongnu people far over here. And as you can see, them encroaching upon the Roman Empire here. So that is the Huns and Attila, and now we will move to the 16 Kingdoms period. My apologies, it's not the most beautiful slide that I've been able to produce, but there are fewer images because first we're covering 16 kingdoms, and it's also a long time ago, and I could not find an image of Fu Jian either, so I have the Chinese characters and en lieu, that's in French, in place of an image. But nonetheless, we have a lot of information regarding the capitals, as we shall see, which is very important in this context specifically. And as mentioned previously, we've covered the Warring States period and the Three Kingdoms period. And this is the 16 Kingdoms period, which is another intermediary period split between many of the great dynasties that we have covered. We've covered Xia, that's Xia. We've covered Qin, for example, Jin, and many other dynasties as well. So this is an important period that we cannot neglect these intermediary periods, because otherwise we'll have huge gaps in our history of China. So the 16 Kingdoms period, which lasts between 304 to 439 CE Common Era, was the tumultuous time in Chinese history marked by the fragmentation of the Qin, that's Jin dynasty, and the emergence of multiple independent states in northern China. This period saw the rise and fall of various ethnic groups and warlords, each vying for control over the northern territories. Therefore, we seek to find a history of the rise and fall of many of these kingdoms, or the period more generally. So the 16 Kingdoms, also less commonly known as the 16 States, was a chaotic period of Chinese history, once again from 304 to 439 CE Common Era, when northern China fragmented into a series of short-lived dynastic states. But it must be noted during this time that the southern Qin, as we covered, so I hope you've seen that episode on the Qin dynasty, or if you have not, I'm grateful if you do, and if you have, I'm grateful that you have. But they lost the northern part first into the 16 states, but the southern portion still lasted for a little while longer. The majority of these states were founded by the 5 barbarians, non-Han people who had settled in northern and western China during the preceding centuries and had launched a series of rebellions against the western Qin dynasty. So pardon me, it's the western and eastern Qin, but geographically it's kind of close to, in some ways, like a north and south, but it is west and east, pardon me, and the west fell before the east. And it must be noted the Great Wall of China, which was produced in the before Common Era, so long time before, and many of the previous dynasties that we've covered, and across different dynasties. But the reason why they built the wall was to keep these barbarians, these nomadic barbarians, out. But during the 16 Kingdoms period, it seems as though many of these barbarians passed the wall and claimed territories within ancient China. And these were non-Han people, so ethnically different as well. They had launched a series of rebellions against the Western Qin dynasty in the early 4th century. However, several of the states were founded by the Han people, so some were Han people, some were non-Han barbarians, as they were called. And all of the states, whether ruled by the Xiongnu, Xianbei, so we call it the Xiongnu Confederation, the Xianbei, the Jie, or the Jie, that's Jie, or the Jian, that's Qiang, the Han, or others. So there were many different groups of ethnic groups within these 16 states. But they nonetheless took on Han-style dynastic names. So even if they came from Xiongnu descendants, they adopted sort of these Han names, making sort of converging into the Chinese cult history. The states frequently fought against both one another and the Eastern Qin dynasty, which remained, which succeeded the Western Qin in 317 CE and ruled southern China as the Eastern Qin dynasty. The period ended with the unification of northern China in 439 by the Northern Wei, a dynasty established by the Xianbei Tuobo clan, that's Xianbei, and Xiongnu, as we mentioned, is Xiongnu. And I pronounce it Xiongnu and Xianbei. That's my best pronunciation I can do thus far. I'm always improving, so I always like that philosophy. It's like, you're not good at something, well, it's a work in progress. So the period ended with the unification of northern China by the Northern Wei, whom we will cover. This occurred 19 years after the Eastern Qin collapse in 420. So Eastern Qin collapsed, but 19 years later, so did the 16 states were consolidated into the Northern Wei. And the Eastern Qin was replaced by the Liu Song dynasty. So the Eastern Qin were replaced by the Liu Song, and the northern portion, which had the 16 states, were consolidated by the Northern Wei, whom we will cover in a specific episode. Following the unification of the North by the Northern Wei, the Northern and Southern dynasties era of the China's history began. So we will cover this as well, this Northern and Southern dynasties period. The term 16 kingdoms was first used by the 6th century historian Hong, that's Cuihong, in the Spring and Autumn Annals of the 16 Kingdoms, and refers to the 5 Liangs. So the 5 Liangs so these are now listing all 16 dynasties. The 5 Liangs are former, later, northern, southern, and western Liang. So that's the first 5. Then there are the 4 Yans, who are the former, later, northern, and southern Yans, and the 3 Qins, that's Quin, which is former, later, and western, and the 2 Chaos, which is Zhao, S to make it plural, which are the Han, the former, and the later. There's also Changhan, and there's also Chia, that's Cheng -Han and Chia, Xia. So those are the 16 kingdoms referred to in that important work. Hong did not count several other kingdoms that appeared at the time, including Ran Wei, Chai Wei, Shuoqi, Duanqi, Chao Shu, Huan Shu, Tuo Hun, and Western Yan. So these are many. There are others, so there may be up to 20, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 20, up to 24 warring states during this period, but the 16 were larger than the remaining 8. And furthermore, my apologies for the pronunciation. There's a lot of names we listed here, but focus primarily on the 5 Liangs, the 4 Yans, the 2 Zhaos, Changhan, and Xia would be the major ones. So, as for some background, so starting with the decline of the Qin dynasty, particularly the Western, which led to the creation of the 16 Kingdoms period. So the 16 Kingdoms period was preceded by the fall of the Western Qin dynasty. Internal strife, external invasions by nomadic groups, and natural disasters weakened the central authority. As further nomadic invasions, Particularly the Xiongnu Confederation, as we covered, began to exert pressures on the northern borders of the Qin dynasty. Some of these nomadic tribes sought refuge in the Qin territories, further contributing to the destabilization of the region. So it's interesting to note that these nomadic people had this desire to invade China at the time. I think it would be that maybe China was more fertile. Otherwise, if the areas that the nomadic people lived were more fertile, perhaps they would have not been nomadic in the first place. So maybe they were nomadic because there wasn't good land for agriculture, so they were invading the fertile land of China. But it must be noted that many of the first dynasties that we covered, a significant contribution they had was irrigation. So maybe they laid all this groundwork, which was ultimately the nomadic people reaped the benefits of the former dynasties of ancient China, who they had irrigation to keep up flooding, but also irrigation to maintain agriculture. But nonetheless, there was invasions from these nomadic peoples, including most prominently Xiongnu. As for the formation of the 16 kingdoms, starting with the Wu Hu uprising, the Wu Hu, or 5 barbarians, were a collective term for various non-Han Chinese ethnic groups. In 304 CE, these groups rebelled against the Qin dynasty, initiating a series of conflicts that would lead to the fragmentation of northern China. Furthermore, the simultaneous rise of multiple states. As the Qin dynasty weakened, various military commanders and leaders from different ethnic backgrounds declared their independence, establishing their own states. These states collectively became known as the 16 kingdoms retroactively. As for further detail on some of the major states, so former Zhao, which lasted from 304 to 329 CE, founded by Liu Yan, a Xiongnu chieftain, former Zhao became one of the dominant powers in northern China under Liu Yan and his successor, Liu Zhong. As for the former Qin as well, Qin, lasted from 351 to 394 CE, and once again, these are just certain of the prominent 16 kingdoms over different spans of time, but worth mentioning. Led by Fu Jian, who we will cover in specific biography, that's Fujian. Former Qin conquered many neighboring states and briefly unified northern China. However, internal strife and rebellion led to its downfall. As for later Zhao, that's Zhao, from 319 to 351 CE, founded by Shi Li, later Zhao expanded its territory significantly, but also faced internal conflicts as well. It was eventually conquered by the former Qin, so incredible amount of dynamics during this period. Furthermore, the Northern Wei, from 386 to 535 CE, so even outlasting this period, formed by the Tuoba clan, part of the Shanbei people, another nomadic group. Northern Wei later split into the Eastern and Western Wei, with the former eventually reunifying northern China. As for the decline and unification, this is broadly speaking with respect to all the 16 kingdoms. Many of the six, it started with internal conflict, so as mentioned with pretty much all other empires, lack of internal control has been a leading cause in the decline of every empire we've covered so far. In many, it's been coupled with external threats as well, but the one thing that's certain is there was internal struggles. It's possible for there to be no external threats and the state to collapse, but it's also possible to have both as well. But it's possible that if it can maintain its internal coherence, it can repel external threats. But often they too feed into each other. If one is weak internally, the external forces capitalize on that. Or if there are threatening external forces, there's often internal strife as well. So they kind of go hand in hand, most likely. So internal conflicts, many of the 16 kingdoms faced internal struggles, including power struggles, succession crises, and ethnic tensions. And I think this is sort of natural. I think there's an argument in War and Peace by Tolstoy that there's sort of a momentum aspect to war. So if things are fragmenting, it tends to continue towards fragmenting. If things are consolidating, it tends to continue towards consolidation, as seen with, for example, as we covered the Alexandrian Empire, specifically the Macedonian Empire in that episode. Alexander conquered, but then as it split off into the separate satraps, such as the Ptolemaic kingdom and the the Seleucid Empire, they sort of just continued to fragment into, for example, the Indo-Bactrian kingdom, Greco-Bactrian kingdom, the Indo-Parthians, etc., and just sort of fragmentation, little bits of consolidation sort of going the other way, but it tended towards fragmentation. So the fact that these were already fragmented from the Western Jin dynasty, I think the momentum was going towards further fragmentation. As for the southern advance, the southern dynasties consisting of the Eastern Jin, Liu Song, Southern Qi, that's Qi, and Liang gradually expanded their influence northward, putting pressure on the 16 kingdoms. As for the Northern Wei unification, the Northern Wei, under the leadership of Xiao Wen, that's Xiaowen, reunified much of northern China in 439 CE, ending the so-called 16 Kingdoms period. Xiao Wen implemented policies to Sinicize, that's to make more Chinese, Chinese in character or form, the ruling elite, fostering a more cohesive and culturally unified state, sort of counterbalancing the invasions from the barbarians who were ethnically different. So sort of, once again, sort of not necessarily a good thing, as we've seen with the indigenous peoples in North America, sort of cultural genocide it was, at least in North America. It seems like something similar might have happened during this period, at least sort of to Sinicize the population or to make more Chinese. As for the legacy, the 16 Kingdoms period left a lasting impact on Chinese history. It marked the beginning of a prolonged era of north-south division, with northern and southern regions developing distinct political, cultural, and social characteristics. This period also saw significant interactions and conflicts between Han, Chinese, and various non-Han ethnic groups, influencing the ethnic composition of northern China for centuries that followed. Very, very important period to sort of see that the sort of population of China does sort of have roots of other people, nomadic groups as well, who invaded and conquered for many years of Chinese history, particularly during this 16 Kingdoms period. So, Fu Jian, to highlight a specific leader from the 16 Kingdoms period, to learn more about it and to learn more about people as well, and leadership. It is challenging to pinpoint a single most important leader during the 16 Kingdoms period, as the era was characterized by the rise and fall of multiple states, each with its own influential leaders. However, one key figure that we can highlight here, who played a crucial role during this period, was Fu Jian, that's Fujian, the founder and ruler of the former Qin, that's Qin, state. Therefore, we should find a biography of his life. So, Fu Jian, also formerly Emperor Xuanzhao, or Xuanzhao of Qin, that's Qin once again, was the third emperor who, however, used the title Heavenly King Tian Wang during his reign of the Di-led Chinese or former Qin dynasty, and he was the sixth of the traditionally recognized 16 kingdoms. Under his reign, Qin unified northern China by conquering the kingdoms of former Yan, Chuo-Qi, former Liang and Dai, as well as the Jin dynasties, Yi province, modern Sichuan, and Chongqing, until he was repelled in the Battle of the Fei River in 383 CE. Following this defeat, the former Qin state disintegrated and Fu was assassinated in 385 CE. We'll discuss this all in further detail. This is an overview for now. By Yao Chang, his former subordinate, who then founded the later Qin dynasty. So, specific biography of his life. So, he was born approximately 337 CE. Fu Jian was born into the ruling family of the Di people, so it came from the royal bloodline, an ethnic group associated with the Xiongnu Confederation, so likely not ethnically Han. His father, Fu Hong, was a prominent general under the later Cao state, that's Zhao. As for his rise to power, Fu Jian rose to prominence in the chaotic political landscape of the 16 Kingdoms period. After the fall of later Cao, Fu Jian seized the opportunity to establish his own state. Former Jin, it's called, in 351 CE. As for his military campaigns, Fu Jian was an ambitious and capable military leader. He launched campaigns to expand the territory of former Jin, conquering neighboring states such as later Liang, former Yan, Western Yan, and Western Yan. His conquests brought large parts of northern China under his rule of the former Jin. At its height, Fu Jian's empire briefly reunified much of the territory that had been fragmented during the earlier stages of the 16 Kingdoms period. So very significant in contributing to the recreation of his Qin state and consolidation of many neighboring regions. Further to his military campaigns, Fu Jian was an ambitious military and capable military leader. He launched campaigns to expand the former territory of Qin, conquering neighboring states, as mentioned, later Liang, former Yan, and Western Yan. And he consolidated much of the territory that had been fragmented during earlier periods of the 16 Kingdoms period. As for his cultural policies, in an attempt to consolidate his rule and promote unity, Fu Jian implemented policies to integrate different ethnic groups within his empire, probably important because they were not the ethnic majority in this region specifically. They were likely non-Han Xianbei people. He encouraged cultural exchanges and sought to assimilate non-Chinese populations, reflecting a trend seen in subsequent dynasties that aim to Sinicize their rule. So nonetheless, maybe even though he came from Xianbei and may not have been ethnically Han, he tried to make his people more Chinese or more Han-like. So maybe he was ethnically Han. It's hard to say. But he did come from likely Xianbei blood. As for his downfall, however, Fu Xian's reign, however, faced internal challenges, as was almost inevitable with these states. His strict rule and ambitious projects, including attempts at administrative reforms and massive construction projects, led to discontent among his officials and the general population. Additionally, his campaigns to conquer Chang Han and Eastern Qin were met with resistance, so he was not able to successfully conquer Eastern Qin, although the Western Qin had long before collapsed. In 385 CE, Fu Jian faced a rebellion by his own son, Fu Pease, who accused him of tyranny. The rebellion succeeded and Fu Jian was captured and executed. Former Qin quickly disintegrated after his death, so that's pretty tragic to have one's own son create a rebellion against them. But for his legacy, Fu Jian's legacy is complex. While he briefly achieved the reunification of northern China, his reign, marked by internal strife, and ultimately ended in failure and death. His attempts at cultural integration and governance influenced later rulers, and during subsequent and the Sinicization policies he implemented and initiated became more prominent during subsequent dynasties. The downfall of the former Qin also paved a way for the emergence of other states in the 16 Kingdoms period, continuing the era of fragmentation in northern China. So for a brief period of defragmentation or consolidation, but once again following the common trend of the 16 Kingdoms period towards fragmentation. So that is Fu Jian. Apologies, there's some conflicting information that can be found regarding him because it's not as well documented as some of the previous leaders, but I hope that by covering him in this way, we've learned a little bit more of what it must have been like to be a leader, and that being said, largely successful leader during the tumultuous 16 Kingdoms period. So to discuss the content of the slide, the title is 16 Kingdoms period and Fu Jian. There was also called the 16 States, and this was a chaotic period in Chinese history when northern China fragmented into a series of short-lived dynastic states. As for significant leader, we've highlighted Fu Jian. Empire, 16 Kingdoms, period 304 to 439 CE or AD, Common Era, or after death is the sort of the religious way of saying it, or the Christian way of saying it, after the death of Jesus Christ. But conventionally people say CE before Common Era now, and before Common Era is BCE. It used to be before Christian Era when I was growing up, but sort of things have become sort of more neutral religiously. As for modern location, would be China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Vietnam. Million square kilometers, we could guess 3.1. So that was this figure. It's really hard to find a figure of what region the full 16 kingdoms covered, and it's probably even larger. The 3.1 figure is the figure I got from what the Eastern and the Western Qin dynasty combined, which is million square kilometers, 1.2. Percent of the world would be 2.3%, and once again, the fact that it was fragmented shows that there was a difficult region to conquer. Capitals. So we have many capitals listed here, and I think it's important to go through because we can kind of, if one is interested in any of these specific dynasties during the 16 Kingdoms period, one can get an image as to where they were located by referencing these capitals listed here. So Luoyang was the capital of the later Han. Pinyang was the capital of the later Zhao. And for spelling, pronunciation, please refer to the slide. I don't think it's meritorious to read out the characters of each one, so my apologies for the spelling, but I hope if you're able to see the slides here, if you're not merely listening, and you're also able to watch the slide, but if you are just listening, that's great as well, then I hope you can check the spelling. So Yicheng was the capital of former Yan. Chang'an was the capital of former Qin. Zhongshan was the capital of Yi. Zhongshan and Yi later. Yi was the capital later of later Yan. Chang'an was the capital of western Yan. Pingshang and Luoyang and Yi were the capitals of northern Hui. Chang'an was the capital of later Qin. Yongzhou was the capital of later Liang. Shaozhou was the capital of southern Liang. And the government was largely monarchies. Common languages were classical Chinese, Shanbei, Di, and Jian, and various nomadic languages. Religion was Buddhism. For example, Fujian promoted Buddhism, but as well Taoism and Chinese folk religions as well, such as ancestor worship, was still practiced in many communities. Populations was tends to over 100 million, so very large relative to the populations of some of the other empires, but we must note that these were fragmented. So it wasn't one empire having 100 million, and compared to the population of China today, it's quite small, but technology has changed, so we can support larger populations. Who knows, maybe the population was even larger, but this is the estimate that we could come across. And maybe it was much less, maybe it was only in the tens of thousands. It should be tens of thousands to over 100, tens of millions to over 100 million. So still quite likely larger than Canada, the country I'm in right now today, which is 36 million. In terms of images, on the top left we have the Chinese characters for Fujian. To the right of that we have some procession based on figurines, so sort of showing some of their military dress that they might have worn. To the right of that we have the ruins of Tongwasheng, the capital of the Xia kingdom, built in the early 5th century by the Xiongnu chieftain Helian Bobo. And it was captured by the Xianbei-led northern Wei in 427. So it's important to note that the Xianbei were attacking the Xianbei too. So it wasn't just clashes based on ethnicity. It was based on just purely groups, not necessarily racial based. As I've referenced many times in the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides notes that the battle between Athens and Sparta was not a racial war because some Illyrians fought on the sides of the Spartans, and some Dorians fought on the side of the Athenians, who were Illyrians. So similar dynamic we can see here. It wasn't the Xiongnu and Xianbei or the non-Hans against the Hans. Sometimes the Xianbei were attacking the Xianbei, or sometimes the Xiongnu were attacking the Xiongnu. Sometimes the Hans were attacking the Hans, most commonly even. And below that we have a closer image of one of the figurines highlighting sort of the military dress they might have worn. Below that we have what's called the White Horse Pagoda in Dunhuang, commemorating Kamarajiva's white horse, which carried the scriptures to China in 384. It was promoted by Fujian, which brought the religion, particularly Buddhism, to China during that time. To the right of that we have a mural showing a leisure produced from either 384 to 441 CE in Dian Sha tomb number 5, which is in later Liang, or perhaps northern Liang. But the reason I added this here is firstly there wasn't too much art that I could find from this period, but also it's important to note that they still, despite the amount of wars going on here, rising and falling of different kingdoms, they still practice quite a bit of leisure. As we can see, they've got instruments, they're playing, they're dancing, they're having fun. So despite all the battles, they still had somewhat of a, they were still found time to have fun in their lives. So. And in the top right, we have a map during 376 CE, so somewhat in the middle of this period. And in the top, in the blue, we have the state of the former Qin, and below that we have the Eastern Qin dynasty. So the state of the former Qin was one that was produced by Fu Xian, and see how large area of land he produced, but nonetheless fragmented once again. It came from fragmented as well, whereas the former Qin lasted quite a little bit longer, but they had before all the way the Western Qin as well. So nonetheless, there was lots going on here, so I hope you are able to, and if you have, I'm grateful that you have, and if you are able to watch the other videos on ancient Chinese history to try to piece together this complex history in this area of the world, important area of the world. So now for a comparison between Attila the Hun and Fu Xian, to learn a little bit more about the leaders and sort of throw back to Plutarch, one of my favorite authors, and sort of the inspiration for this whole journey in history that I've taken. So while Attila the Hun and Fu Xian of the 16 Kingdoms period were leaders of different regions and periods in history, there are some interesting points of comparison between them in terms of their rise to power, military campaigns, and impact on respective regions that we will seek to cover here. So as for their ethnic background, starting with Attila the Hun, he belonged to the Hunnic Confederation, a nomadic group of the Central Asian origin. The Huns were known for their horseback riding and archery skills. Fu Xian was of D ethnicity, associated with the Xiongnu Confederation, another nomadic group in Central Asia. So they both came from nomadic groups. He came from a military background, with his father being a general under the later Cao state. So both of their fathers were quite powerful. I think Attila's father was probably the most powerful chieftain. Was Fu Xian's father the most powerful general? It's hard to say, but the fact that he came to power, he's likely so, or at least similar upbringings. At least both their fathers were capable of war, and sort of put them in a position where they were able to sort of consolidate both of their respective groups. And ethnic background, they're both from nomadic, which makes them more similar in many ways than different. As for their rise to power, Attila the Hun rose to power in the mid-5th century CE and became the sole ruler of the Huns after the death of his brother Bleda. Fu Xian established the former Qin state in 351 CE during the tumultuous 16 Kingdoms period, seizing the opportunity in the aftermath of the fall of the later Cao. So both of them were sort of able to consolidate their states, and but the sort of difference here is that Attila for a time shared the throne with his brother. There's no story of that with Fu Xian. So but maybe Attila killed his brother, which would be quite bad, but maybe he did not, and maybe he was actually able to share the throne quite well. So it's impossible to say, but it's just a dynamic that isn't necessarily existent in Fu Xian's life, for better or worse. As for their respective military campaigns, Attila is best known for his invasions of the Eastern and Western Roman empires. His campaigns, characterized by swift maneuvers and horse archery, once again the added velocity, inflicted significant damage on Roman territories. As for Fu Xian, he expanded former Qin state through for successful military campaigns, conquering neighboring states such as the later Liang, former Yan, and Western Yan. So they both fought formidable formidable foes, but I would say relatively, Attila's fighting against the Western Roman Empire, which was at the time the most formidable force, might have been a bit more challenging, but Fu Xian was sort of on all sides was fighting against formidable enemies. So both of them, I don't think one of them could be said to be a better military leader. If we were to switch places with them, how would they perform? That would be the real test, which is impossible to apply. As for their cultural policies, and his conquest briefly reunified much of northern China. That's Fu Xian. So maybe Fu Xian was able to consolidate his territories a bit better, because at the end of Attila's life, when he came up to Pope Leo and he sort of decided to cease attacking for some reason. Maybe he was admitting defeat, or then maybe he drank himself to death and then got a nosebleed, supposedly, as we can add the histories together. But then Fu Xian was also defeated by his own son, which is worse, hard to say. We shall discuss that a bit more in their deaths to come. I'm jumping ahead of myself here. As for their cultural policies, Attila the Hun's cultural policies are less well documented, but he is known for his role in negotiations and treaties with the Roman Empire. So not focus on culture, but at least to have a certain amount of empathy to be able to negotiate with neighboring states or neighboring enemies. As for Fu Xian, he implemented policies to integrate ethnic groups within his empire and encouraging cultural exchanges and aiming to assimilate non-Han Chinese populations. So that could often be seen as a bad thing, assimilation to the Han people, even if he came from the Di people, the Xianbei people. So maybe he was not even Han himself, and he was trying to assimilate people into Han, Han culture. But maybe he was Han, and maybe it was not a bad form of assimilation. Maybe it was in a positive way, not in as we saw in the indigenous history of North America. As for their respective downfalls, so Attila the Hun's death in 453 CE marked the beginning of the fragmentation of the Hunnic Confederation, and the Huns faced internal conflicts and external pressures. So as mentioned, with all these leaders who covered the zenith of their empire, the fact that they were at the zenith means there was often, there certainly must have been a decline after them. So as great as he was during his own time, it wasn't sustainable following his life. As for Fu Xian, he faced internal rebellions, and his own son, Fu Pi, accused him of tyranny. This led to Fu Xian's capture and execution in 385 CE, and the former Qin quickly disintegrated. So Attila the Hun, it's not certain. He maybe died of a nosebleed, maybe he drank too much, maybe both, but I think those are still better ways to die than one's own son accusing one of tyranny, capturing and killing you. I think I'd rather have a nosebleed and die, or I'd rather even drink to death than to have one's own son accuse one of tyranny, capture one, and kill one. And that also, Fu Xian, like Attila, his death marked the decline of his state, the former Qin. As for their respective legacies, Attila left a lasting impact on European history, contributing to the decline of the Western Roman Empire and influencing subsequent migrations of various tribes. It must be noted that I knew about his name even when I was a child, when I was even very young, whereas I didn't know of Fu Xian until pretty recently, so it is important to note. But maybe you knew about Fu Xian and did not know about Attila, so it's up to debate, but I do think Attila is more commonly known than Fu Xian. Fu Xian's legacy is complex. His brief unification of northern China influenced later rulers, and his Sinicization policies had implications for governance of diverse ethnic groups in the region. So his Sinicization was continued even though his state did not. The Sinicization, the Chinification, or the Hanification. Thus, both Attila the Hun and Fu Xian were leaders of nomadic origins who rose to power during periods of political turmoil. They expanded their territories through military conquest, but ultimately faced internal challenges that led to their downfall. So quite similar trajectory in many ways. And their legacies include influencing the cultures and governance structures of the regions they once ruled. So both very important leaders, both very important empires and very important periods that I'm thankful that you have learned about with me. So that is this episode of Ages of Empires on the Huns and Attila and the 16 Kingdoms period. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. This is Cashcroft TV, and I'm very grateful for your support, and I'd be very grateful if you continue to provide it. Thank you so much.